The North Atlantic, winter of 1942. Black water stretched to the horizon, broken only by slow merchant ships pushing west through heavy waves. Somewhere beneath those dark swells, a German U-boat waited silently. Its engines were quiet. Its crew watched through the periscope as a convoy moved steadily across the ocean. Dozens of cargo ships carrying fuel, ammunition, and food toward Britain. To the men inside the submarine, it looked like an easy hunt. At this stage of the war, the German submarine commanders had grown confident in the Atlantic. The ocean was enormous, and Allied shipping lanes were crowded with merchant vessels trying to keep Britain supplied. Convoys did travel together for protection, but the escorts were often thin and the distances vast. For U-boat crews trained in stealth and patience, these convoys represented opportunity. A single submarine could slip into position during darkness, launch torpedoes, and vanish again into the deep water before the escorts could react. Many German commanders believed the Atlantic had effectively become their battlefield. The combination of surprise attacks and coordinated submarine tactics had already produced devastating results. In several engagements, convoys had been struck repeatedly during the same night, as multiple submarines converged on the same group of ships. Torpedoes would erupt into explosions along the convoy line, turning cargo vessels into burning silhouettes against the dark ocean. From the perspective of U-boat crews, the advantages were clear. Submarines could travel long distances without detection, approach targets at night on the surface, and strike suddenly before diving beneath the waves again. Allied destroyers and escorts did their best to protect the convoys, but the ocean was wide and the attacks unpredictable. Often, by the time escorts reacted, the submarine had already slipped away into the depths. The crews inside those submarines began to see the Atlantic as a place where patience and skill almost always produced results. Merchant convoys were slow. Their routes were predictable. And most importantly, large portions of the Atlantic remained far beyond the reach of Allied aircraft. Without aircraft overhead, the convoys depended entirely on their escort ships for defense. That limitation created a dangerous gap in the ocean, one where U-boats could operate with far greater freedom. German commanders understood this weakness well. As long as the convoys moved through areas where aircraft could not patrol, submarines would have the advantage. Inside the control room of a U-boat, the atmosphere during these hunts was tense but confident. Officers studied maps and convoy reports, while the crew prepared torpedoes in silence. When the moment came, the attack would unfold quickly. A spread of torpedoes, launched from the darkness, could cripple several ships in seconds. For a time, it seemed that the Atlantic truly belonged to the submarines. Convoys continued to cross the ocean, and U-boat commanders believed they had found the perfect hunting ground. But across the same ocean, Allied planners were quietly working on a new idea, one that would soon turn those hunters into targets themselves. During the early years of the Atlantic War, German submarines possessed a combination of tactical advantages that made them extremely difficult for Allied forces to counter. These submarines were designed not only for stealth, but also for long-range patrols that allowed them to operate deep into shipping lanes, where merchant convoys had little protection. The Atlantic Ocean itself played a major role in this advantage. Its vast size meant that even when convoys were escorted by destroyers or smaller warships, those escorts could not cover every direction or detect every submarine approaching beneath the waves. German commanders developed a strategy that took full advantage of this environment. Known as the Wolfpack tactic, it allowed multiple submarines to cooperate when attacking convoys. When a U-boat located a convoy, it would shadow the ships while sending a radio message back to command. Other submarines operating nearby would then converge on the same location. Instead of a single submarine attacking alone, several U-boats could strike the convoy from different directions during the same night. This created confusion among the escort ships and increased the chances of torpedo hits. Night operations made these attacks even more effective. At night, Submarines could travel on the surface of the ocean where they were faster and more maneuverable than when submerged. In darkness, then it was extremely difficult for convoy escorts to visually detect a submarine approaching from the surface. This allowed U-boat crews to maneuver into firing position with relative freedom before launching their torpedoes. Once the attack began, the submarine could dive quickly beneath the water and disappear into the darkness below the convoy. Convoy escorts faced a difficult challenge during these attacks. Destroyers and corvettes were equipped with sonar systems that could detect submarines underwater, but these systems worked best against targets that were already submerged. When submarines attacked from the surface at night, detection became far more difficult. By the time escorts realized what was happening, the attacking submarine often had time to dive and move away from the convoy's immediate path. Another major advantage for the submarines was the absence of continuous air patrols across large portions of the Atlantic. Aircraft were extremely effective at spotting submarines from above, especially when the submarines were traveling on the surface. However, land-based aircraft had limited range. This meant that many convoys crossing the ocean eventually reached areas where no aircraft could patrol overhead. In these regions, sometimes called the air gap, convoys were left to rely solely on their escort ships for defense. German commanders quickly understood how important this gap was. When convoys entered areas without air cover, submarines could attack with far less risk of being spotted from the sky. As long as aircraft could not reach these waters, U-boat crews believed they could continue hunting convoys with confidence. For a time, this assumption proved correct, and the Atlantic remained a dangerous battlefield for any ship attempting to cross it. The convoy system was designed as the Allies' primary defense against submarine attacks in the Atlantic. Instead of allowing merchant ships to travel alone across the ocean, dozens of cargo vessels were grouped together into large formations and escorted by warships. In theory, this system reduced the chances of submarines finding isolated ships and allowed escort vessels to concentrate their defenses around a single group. A convoy might include 30 to 60 merchant ships carrying fuel, weapons, food supplies, and military equipment bound for Britain or other Allied ports. While this strategy offered some protection, it also created new challenges. Convoys moved at the speed of their slowest ship, often no faster than 8 to 10 knots. This made them predictable targets once their position was discovered. A U-boat commander who spotted a convoy could estimate its course and speed with relative accuracy. Even if the submarine had to withdraw temporarily, it could often return later and intercept the convoy again along its projected route. Escort ships attempted to guard the convoy from multiple directions, but the ocean surrounding a convoy formation was enormous. A typical escort group might include a handful of destroyers, corvettes, or smaller anti-submarine vessels. These ships were responsible for protecting a formation that could stretch several kilometers across the water. Even when the escorts were well-trained and equipped with sonar and depth charges, they could not monitor every section of ocean around the convoy at all times. This weakness became especially dangerous during nighttime operations. As darkness fell, visibility across the ocean dropped dramatically. Merchant ships maintained strict formation discipline to avoid collisions, but the escorts struggled to detect submarines approaching from the surface. The German U-boats often took advantage of these conditions by maneuvering between the columns of merchant ships during night attacks. From the perspective of a submarine commander, the convoy could appear as a cluster of slow-moving targets silhouetted against the horizon. Once inside the convoy's perimeter, a submarine could launch torpedoes at several ships in quick succession. The explosions would create confusion across the formation as damaged ships slowed or stopped in the water. Escort vessels would rush toward the attack area, attempting to locate the submarine responsible. But while the escorts focused on one threat, other U-boats participating in the Wolfpack attack could move into new firing positions around the convoy. These repeated attacks demonstrated that while convoys improved merchant ship survival, they were not a perfect solution. Submarines still possessed the ability to infiltrate formations, launch devastating torpedo strikes, and escape beneath the waves. As long as U-boats could operate without constant air surveillance, the convoy system remained vulnerable to determined submarine commanders. Despite the convoy system and the growing number of escort ships protecting Allied merchant traffic, one enormous weakness still remained in the Atlantic defense network. This weakness was not a ship, a weapon, or a tactical mistake. It was geography. The Atlantic Ocean was so vast that aircraft flying from land bases simply could not cover its entire distance. Even the most capable patrol aircraft of the early war period had a limited operational range. And once convoys moved far enough from the coasts of North America or Britain, they entered a zone where no friendly aircraft could reach them. This region became known among naval planners as the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap. It stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean where convoys were effectively blind to aerial protection. Aircraft played a critical role in anti-submarine warfare because they could detect submarines from above, especially when the submarines were traveling on the surface. From the air, the dark outline of a U-boat cutting through the water could often be spotted long before ships below could detect it. Aircraft could also attack quickly with depth charges, forcing submarines to dive and abandon their approach to the convoy. But in the air gap, those aircraft simply were not present. When convoys entered the central portion of the Atlantic, they lost one of their most effective defensive tools. Escort ships remained with the formation. But without aircraft scanning the ocean ahead of them, submarines could approach much more easily. U-boat commanders quickly learned how to exploit this gap. Patrol lines of submarines were often positioned along expected convoy routes, so that the first submarine to sight a convoy could signal others to converge. Once the convoy reached the air gap, attacks frequently intensified because the submarines knew that aircraft would not suddenly appear overhead. For German commanders directing the submarine campaign, the existence of the air gap was a major strategic advantage. It meant that even if Allied escorts improved their tactics or increased the number of ships guarding convoys, there would still be a large region of ocean where submarines could operate with relatively low risk of aerial detection. As long as aircraft could not patrol these waters continuously, the U-boat fleet would retain the opportunity to strike shipping lines at the most vulnerable point of the journey. Allied planners recognized this problem early in the war, but solving it proved difficult. Extending aircraft range required either new aircraft designs or bases much closer to the center of the Atlantic. Both solutions would take time. Until then, every convoy crossing the ocean had to pass through the same dangerous corridor, where the protective umbrella of air power simply disappeared. And in that corridor, the submarines waited. As the Battle of the Atlantic intensified, Allied commanders understood that solving the Mid-Atlantic air gap was essential to protecting convoy routes. Aircraft had already proven to be one of the most effective weapons against submarines. When patrol aircraft appeared above a convoy, U-boat crews were forced to dive quickly, abandoning their attacks and hiding beneath the water. Even if the aircraft did not destroy the submarine, but it disrupted the attack and bought valuable time for the convoy to move beyond danger. The problem was that land-based aircraft simply could not remain over convoys once they moved too far from shore. The solution that gradually emerged was the escort carrier. Unlike the large fleet carriers used in major naval battles, escort carriers were smaller, slower ships designed specifically to provide air cover for convoys crossing the Atlantic. Again, these vessels were often converted from merchant ship hulls and carried a relatively small number of aircraft, usually between 20 and 30. Although they lacked the speed and heavy protection of larger carriers, escort carriers had one critical advantage. They could travel directly alongside the convoys they were protecting. By sailing with the convoy itself, escort carriers brought aircraft directly into the heart of the Atlantic shipping lanes. Instead of relying on distant airfields, the convoy now had its own mobile airbase. Aircraft could take off from the carrier's flight deck, patrol the surrounding ocean, and search for submarines attempting to approach the merchant ships. These patrols extended the convoy's defensive perimeter far beyond the range of sonar detection from escort ships alone. The aircraft carried by escort carriers were well suited for anti-submarine warfare. Fighters such as the Grumman F-4F Wildcat could patrol above the convoy. They intercept enemy reconnaissance aircraft and attack submarines spotted on the surface. Torpedo bombers like the Grumman TB-F Avenger were even more effective in the anti-submarine role. Equipped with depth charges, rockets, and radar detection equipment, these aircraft could locate submarines from the air and launch attacks before the submarines had time to dive to safety. For U-boat commanders, the appearance of escort carriers introduced a completely new threat. The convoys that once seemed vulnerable in the open Atlantic now carried their own air patrols. Submarines approaching the convoy could suddenly find aircraft overhead even hundreds of miles from land. This meant that the safe hunting conditions that had once existed inside the air gap were beginning to disappear. The escort carrier did not eliminate the submarine threat overnight, but it fundamentally changed the balance of the Atlantic battle. For the first time, the convoys traveling across the deepest parts of the ocean could maintain continuous air protection, something that had once seemed impossible. For many U-boat commanders, the first encounters with escort carrier aircraft came as a surprise. For years, submarine crews had learned that the safest place to operate was far from land, deep in the Atlantic where aircraft rarely appeared. In these waters, submarines could surface at night, recharge batteries, and position themselves for attacks against approaching convoys. Once the convoy entered the air gap, the submarines expected to operate without the constant threat of aircraft detection. Escort carriers quietly removed that advantage. Convoys that previously appeared ordinary through a submarine periscope could now carry their own air patrols. From the perspective of a U-boat commander observing from underwater, everything might look normal at first. Merchant ships moved slowly in formation, escorted by a few warships scanning the surrounding sea. But somewhere within that convoy, often several miles away, a small carrier was launching aircraft that would soon begin circling above the ocean. Once those aircraft began patrolling, the situation for the submarines changed dramatically. Aircraft could search wide areas of ocean in a short time, scanning the water for the telltale outline of a submarine moving on the surface. When submarines traveled on the surface to conserve battery power or increase speed, they became visible from above. Even a distant aircraft approaching the area could force the submarine to dive immediately, interrupting its attack plans and reducing its ability to maneuver into firing position. The presence of aircraft also created constant pressure on submarine crews. A surface submarine could normally move faster and had better visibility, allowing it to intercept convoys effectively. But when aircraft patrols were active, surfacing became far more dangerous. The submarines were forced to remain underwater longer, moving slowly and relying on limited battery power. This reduced their ability to pursue convoys or reposition themselves for coordinated Wolfpack attacks. Aircraft from escort carriers also carried weapons designed specifically to attack submarines. Depth charges could be dropped directly into the water where a submarine was believed to be diving. And rockets or machine gun fire could damage submarines caught on the surface before they had time to submerge. Even if the aircraft did not destroy the submarine, the sudden attack forced the crew to dive and abandon their position near the convoy. As these encounters became more common, U-boat commanders began to realize that the Atlantic was no longer the same hunting ground it had once been. The air gap that had once protected their operations was slowly disappearing. Instead of stalking convoys without interference, submarines now had to watch the skies as carefully as they watched the sea. As escort carriers became more common in convoy operations, their presence began to alter the entire rhythm of submarine warfare in the Atlantic. The advantage that U-boat commanders had relied upon for several years was gradually eroding. Convoys were no longer isolated groups of merchant ships guarded only by a handful of destroyers. With escort carriers accompanying them across the ocean, convoys could now maintain continuous air patrols even in the deepest parts of the Atlantic. These aircraft patrols created a new layer of defense around the convoys. Instead of waiting for submarines to attack before responding, Allied forces could now search actively for submarines long before they reached firing range. Aircraft flying above the convoy could sweep wide sections of ocean, scanning the surface for submarines attempting to maneuver into position. When a submarine was spotted, the aircraft could attack immediately or guide escort ships to the location using radio communication. This changed the dynamic of submarine attacks significantly. Previously, U-boats could approach convoys relatively freely in the air gap, positioning themselves ahead of the ships and preparing coordinated Wolfpack attacks. With aircraft constantly patrolling overhead, those movements became far more difficult. Submarines attempting to surface risked being detected from the air, and remaining underwater limited their speed and endurance. The combination of reduced mobility and increased surveillance made it harder for U-boat crews to organize effective attacks. Escort carrier aircraft also extended the defensive reach of the convoy far beyond what surface escorts could achieve alone. Destroyers and corvettes relied on sonar to detect submarines underwater, but sonar worked best once a submarine was already close to the convoy. Aircraft, on the other hand, could locate submarines many miles away before they posed an immediate threat. By forcing submarines to dive early, the aircraft disrupted attacks before they could even begin. The psychological effect on submarine crews was equally important. For years, U-boat commanders had operated with confidence in the open Atlantic, believing that distance protected them from air attack. Now that aircraft could appear unexpectedly far from land, that sense of security began to disappear. Submarine crews had to remain cautious even in areas where they once felt safe. As more escort carriers entered service, this pattern repeated itself across convoy routes. Aircraft patrols became a routine part of Atlantic crossings, and submarines found it increasingly difficult to approach convoys without being detected. The hunters that once dominated the Atlantic were now facing a battlefield where the enemy could see them from above. As escort carriers became integrated into convoy operations, their impact spread rapidly across the Atlantic theater. What began as an experimental solution to the air gap soon developed into a permanent part of Allied naval strategy. Instead of relying solely on destroyers and corvettes to defend merchant ships, convoys now traveled with their own mobile air support, allowing aircraft to patrol vast sections of ocean that had previously been beyond reach. The aircraft launched from escort carriers performed several critical tasks at once. Some aircraft flew continuous patrol patterns around the convoy, scanning the ocean surface for submarines attempting to approach. Others searched farther ahead of the convoy, investigating suspicious contacts or guiding escort ships toward potential submarine positions. This extended surveillance network dramatically increased the difficulty for U-boats attempting to intercept convoy routes. Aircraft also introduced speed and flexibility that surface escorts alone could not provide. A destroyer might require significant time to reach a submarine sighting several miles away from the convoy. Aircraft, however, could reach the same location in minutes. Once overhead, they could attack immediately with depth charges or rockets, forcing submarines to dive or risk serious damage. Even if the submarine escaped destruction, the disruption prevented it from maintaining contact with the convoy. Another major advantage of escort carriers was their ability to maintain persistent coverage. Because they traveled with the convoy, aircraft could launch patrols throughout the entire crossing rather than only near coastal areas. This effectively eliminated the large stretches of ocean where submarines had once operated without fear of aerial detection. The convoys were no longer passing through a single dangerous zone in the center of the Atlantic. Instead, they were moving under an expanding umbrella of reconnaissance and protection. For U-boat commanders, this shift gradually changed the strategic picture of the Atlantic campaign. Submarines that attempted to attack convoys often encountered aircraft patrols long before reaching effective torpedo range. These early detections forced submarines to dive prematurely, thus slowing them down and breaking their contact with the convoy formation. Without the ability to maintain visual or radar contact, organizing coordinated Wolfpack attacks became increasingly difficult. Over time, this constant pressure from the air reduced the effectiveness of submarine operations against convoys. Attacks became less frequent, and submarines spent more time evading detection than positioning themselves for torpedo launches. The Atlantic, once considered a vast hunting ground for submarines, was gradually turning into a far more hostile environment for U-boat crews operating beneath its waters. By the later stages of the Atlantic campaign, the widespread use of escort carriers had transformed convoy protection in ways that German submarine commanders had not originally anticipated. The Atlantic Ocean was still vast and dangerous, but the conditions that had once allowed submarines to dominate shipping routes were steadily disappearing. Instead of moving through isolated regions without aerial surveillance, convoys now carried their own protective air patrols across much of the ocean. The combination of escort carriers, improved radar technology, and better coordination between aircraft and surface escorts made submarine attacks far more difficult to execute successfully. Aircraft flying from escort carriers could locate submarines long before they reached torpedo range, forcing them to dive and abandon their approach. Once submerged, submarines moved much more slowly and had limited battery endurance, which made it harder for them to pursue convoys or reposition themselves for additional attacks. This constant pressure from the air changed the way submarines operated in the Atlantic. U-boat commanders who had once relied on surprise and freedom of movement now had to remain cautious, even in areas that were previously considered safe. Surfacing to recharge batteries or to gain speed became riskier when aircraft patrols might appear overhead at any moment. Every surface submarine became a potential target for aircraft equipped with radar, depth charges, and rockets. Convoys themselves also became more resilient under this new system. Merchant ships continued to cross the Atlantic in large formations, but now they were supported by multiple layers of defense. Surface escorts guarded the immediate perimeter of the convoy, while aircraft from escort carriers searched the surrounding ocean for threats. Together, these forces created a defensive network that was far more difficult for submarines to penetrate. For the submarine campaign, this shift represented a gradual loss of the strategic advantage that had once defined the early years of the Atlantic War. Submarines could still attack when opportunities appeared, but the conditions that had allowed repeated successful strikes were becoming increasingly rare. Convoys were no longer isolated targets crossing a dangerous ocean alone. The Atlantic itself had not changed. The same storms, waves, and vast distances remained. But the balance of the battle across those waters had shifted. What had once been a hunting ground for submarines was now a far more contested environment, where aircraft, ships, and coordinated tactics worked together to protect the vital supply routes that crossed the ocean.